All right, guys. Well, thanks for the group sticking around here, and it's probably be pretty free flowing, I'm guessing.
Yep.
So, well, Alan, what I'd just like to ask. So, we're a small church, obviously. Maybe we'll get there at some point in terms of what should we know as a community of believers, diverse in who we are, about what's currently going on in the country, how the reality of what the Bible says that you talked about today, how should that impact us as a small community here? And then, weave in whatever you think about the current state of things at the border and current policies that are affecting things. So I don't know. Yeah.
Well, let's make this a conversation, and so I'll get started. And just as you, if you want me to clarify or you have other questions, because I know you follow me. You follow me on Twitter. It sounds like a thing. It's not even anything.
It's a good follow.
Yeah, but but you see a lot of stuff that I share, and so you kind of have a perspective on what's happening. So you can come on, right? And obviously, any questions any of you guys have too. But starting from a church perspective, so I'm a minister of the gospel. I'm called to proclaim Christ. That's what God's called me to do. I pastored for 16 years. We started with my church. We grew, and then we started we helped facilitate a Hispanic church that got started, and then a Korean church. And the Korean church was there for a few years, and then kind of didn't quite work out. But our heart was to try to bring nations together. And then Montgomery, Alabama, the background there, obviously, the first capital of the Confederacy, where the Civil War started there, because the message to fire on Fort Sumter was sent from Montgomery, Alabama. And then 100 years later, you have the Civil Rights Movement that started in Montgomery with Montgomery Bus Boycott and Martin Luther King Jr. and Rosa Parks. And so it's a really interesting place. It's the Deep South, but it has this legacy and this history of this massive division of the nation racially. Then you have segregation. Then you had people rise up against this, and they were believers. They were Christians. And they said, we read the Bible, and the Bible says that we're to treat one another well. We're supposed to have justice. That's not happening to us. And white Christians aren't treating us the way we should be treated. So we're going to, speak out, and we're going to take our case both to the church as well as to the government. And so that's the history, that's the legacy of where I've been. I pastored there for a long time. And it wasn't, when I got there in 2000, I wanted to understand this background and history, but it wasn't really the present reality that there was this big justice movement happening in Montgomery. Things kind of went back to, in a lot of ways, in the churches the way they were, and people remained separate. Even though there was a lot of desire for unity being expressed, it wasn't necessarily affecting, a lot of things. So it isn't like a place that has active racial division. It's just more of like silent. Everybody just kind of goes their own way, and we kind of have figured out how to live together. And there's a lot of progress being made now, I think. So that's kind of my background. And so in everything that I do on immigration, it came from my own ministry, doing missions around the world. I've been to 19 different countries, 18, 19 different countries, I guess, helping with pastors and churches, and just visiting sometimes, like just passing through and, seeing things. So all of that kind of went together, and then I had this opportunity to begin to work on behalf of immigrants and refugees in the Southeast with the Evangelical Immigration Table, and with my own Baptist association as well. That opportunity has opened up to do it locally as well as regionally, and then encourage it globally as well. And so your question about what you can do, I'm kind of giving that background because what I want you to know is that everything that I do on this, I start with, from my own perspective, what does Scripture say about how we're to treat people? People who come from different places and backgrounds, people who are vulnerable. And so whether I'm talking about strictly what the Bible says and quoting Scripture and preaching the gospel, or whether I'm talking about policy stuff in DC and then, in the States, I'm always thinking from how can we position to tell a better story, a gospel story, that we reflect God's heart, everywhere. So your church can do that too. You already are doing that by the community that you have together. The fact that you are people from different backgrounds, economic backgrounds, education, maybe you live in different neighborhoods, you have different race and ethnic backgrounds, those types of things. The fact that that's going on here provides a model for other people. So just by nature of being Christians together and loving each other, that's the first step. And then from there, you're able to speak, and you think, well, what can we say? What can we do? First of all, just to let you know what's happening nationally, immigration is a big issue. It's been a big issue for a long time. What happens to immigrants who come here? What about people who come here illegally? What about people who overstay their visas? 40% of undocumented immigrants are visa overstays. They're not people who came across the southern border. They're people who came here legally, and then they didn't go home when they were supposed to. And so that's, we have 11 million undocumented immigrants. 40% of them stayed too long. We have situations where people came and then they have children who are U.S. citizens and they're born here and now they're undocumented. The parents are, and they don't know where to go or how to navigate this because they can't get legal now. But then you also have legal immigration, which is also under fire right now, as the government is trying to reduce the numbers of legal immigration by 40 to 50% as well. And so it isn't just about illegal immigration, it's also about cutting legal immigration. And so you have just this whole conversation: who gets to come here to America? Why do they get to come? What happens when they get here? Do they just kind of go to their own, to people who are just like them? And what role does the church play in that, right? So these are the questions that are being asked right now in America in 2018, both in Washington, D.C., amongst politicians, amongst different ethnic groups. How are we going to learn to live together? America is scheduled to be, based on birth rates and demographics, a majority-minority country by 2043, I think. So that means that, whites will still be a plurality. They'll still be the largest group, but they won't be the majority anymore. They'll drop under 50% around 2043, 2045. Some people say, well, that's a big deal. I don't know how much that's really going to affect because you have all these different ethnic groups and they don't really come together either, like against white people. But what happens is there are a lot of white people who are afraid of that date. And they're afraid of what might happen when they no longer are in power with a majority. And so you're starting to see a reaction against that. You're starting to see people who fear change and fear being the minority across the country, especially where I am in the South and Midwest and people and places like that. And so there's this reaction brewing, which is causing a lot of the anti-immigrant backlash. And then you have other people say, well, this is actually a pretty good thing. It works pretty well here. We have people from different backgrounds or perspectives that come together. So trying to get that conversation going between people who are learning how to live together from different backgrounds and different perspectives, and then be able to talk to people who haven't experienced that and who are afraid of what that might be is a really important thing for America right now. And it's an important thing for churches as well. Like I was saying at the end, there are churches that live in a ethnically diverse area and the church is all white or all black or all Hispanic or all Asian or whatever it might be, as far as the background. And people are afraid of what happens if I actually get close, like in my spiritual life, to people who are different from me. Will they accept me? Will they reject me? And so we're in this really unique time. I mean, it's always a unique time in American history. We can always say that. But I really think I can point out and say why we are, because this question is being asked. How do we live life together when we have such diverse backgrounds in our nation? And our nation doesn't know how to answer that question. There's confusion. There are a lot of different competing ideas, and there's fear. The church, and what I was preaching today, we have the answer to that question. And so we can bring the answer in. And what's really interesting right now, and I was talking about this last night, right now the rest of the country is actually inviting the church in to help solve this problem because they don't know how to do it. I'm seeing this in university campuses. I'm seeing this in communities and with cities and with government and all these different places that I wouldn't normally have been invited to go and talk about Jesus. I'm actually being invited. Yeah, come tell us how you see this, because the church is considered one of the major entities in our culture that can help solve this problem. And so that's what I'm getting to do as well, not just speaking in churches, but speaking and talking with other groups as well. So I just want to encourage you as this, I know California is a very different environment than Alabama or Mississippi or Tennessee. Well, but there is change that's happening. You're a little bit different environment politically because it's more accepted here that everybody gets along and comes together. But you have a message to share with others who don't know how to do this. Does that make sense? And so even though you're a small church, there are ways you can tell your story and ways that you can get the word to others that, hey, this isn't that scary and this does work, especially if you put Jesus in the middle of it. There are ways that we can come together. So that's a good place to start. As I'm not talking about the policy stuff yet, but if you want to know where to start, to have the confidence that you being a church and you being Christians who are living life together matters, that you can speak from that place to the powers that be across the country and say, hey, we're figuring it out. You can too, and that people are actually listening to you when you do that. Yeah.
Yeah, one of the things that's interesting about our church is we're actually more diverse than the exact community that we're in. Studio City itself, Studio City tends to be much more wealthy, in case you guys didn't know, and actually much more white, even though a lot of that white is a lot of Jewish families that come from there. And so I think one of the things that I think is, I hope, a blessing for anyone that comes in these doors is they do see people from lots of different backgrounds and economic backgrounds. But we have, this is, so our area, Los Angeles is very, it's so spread out, and it's so big that each community kind of takes on its own identity. But you have those socioeconomic things that take place. So as soon as you cross the 101, things change. And as soon as you get outside of Valley Village, you go to North Hollywood, demographics change. And you'll even hear people in Studio City say, "Oh, I don't go up above Burbank Boulevard or whatever because of X, Y, or Z."
Right.
And so we still have some of those differences break down among people in Studio City don't really send their kids to the public high school. It's the public high school is about 80-90% Latino, and a lot of people have the means and the money here to go to great, wonderful schools. So some of those issues still play out in terms of, I think your message is very relevant for a wealthier population, or a population like Studio City, which is saying, what are ways we can bring in the other? Who are people that you wouldn't normally hang out with and be around, and you can still welcome them and see who are the other and how do you bring them in? So
I'm always convinced, wherever I've lived and wherever I've been, that there, especially if you live in a place where there are thousands of people, right? And then you kind of see how many churches there are and how many people are in church. I'm like, Lord, I know, this is true when I was pastoring in Montgomery. It's true when I was in seminary up in the San Francisco Bay Area, and I would just pray and I would say, God, I know that there are 100 people that if I could meet them and share the love of Christ with and welcome them into my life, that they would come to know you, and that they would, maybe join together, with a group of believers to grow. Lord, there has to be 100 people, 200 people, right? Lord, show me those people. Bring me to those people, and they're on the outside. They're outcasts perhaps, or they've never been invited anywhere. They sit home for Thanksgiving, or my wife and I, and this was with our international ministry, but every year when I was pastoring my church, we had a Christmas Eve service. And so that's where I was. We never traveled on Christmas, and then when I left pastoring, we traveled the next couple of Christmases, went to visit family. That's the first time our kids had ever done that. It's kind of this pastor's kids have a different routine than others. But then this past year, we stayed in Montgomery at our home. We went to the church we're going to now, our Christmas Eve service there. And but about 3 days before Christmas, I realized we're going to be at our home for Christmas, and I won't be pastoring a church where I have to do the Christmas Eve service. So I started thinking. So I contacted people with our international ministry at our church. I said, what if we invited people to our home on Christmas Eve, whoever wanted to come, didn't know where to go? And they said, okay. And it was just like a couple of days early. So we made some soup and had some bread and things like that. And we just told people to bring stuff. And then people started inviting other people as well who didn't have anywhere to go. They didn't even go to our church. And on Christmas Eve, we had people I think we had about 30 people come to our house, and from all these different nations. Some of them were from China, and they had never been to an American home. They'd never been to church or anything, but they just got invited for Christmas Eve. And so we all sat around we ate and we shared things. We had a family who came from they were friends of mine. They were immigrants from Mexico, and he had 6 kids, and so I invited them to come. They lived in a very poor neighborhood, not far away from us. But I called him and said, would you come to my house for Christmas Eve? So he brings his family and the 6 children and his wife and mother. So there's 9 of them. So we put them around the dining room table in our front room. And then they got to sit at the main table, and everybody else was all around. And so I went and because they're very, very poor, but and they didn't have they weren't able to do Christmas presents and things like that. So we went and we bought them Christmas presents. So we gave the kids presents. And then when they were leaving, we gave them these gingerbread houses that my mother-in-law had. Anyway, the point of all this was he called me later and he said, we've never been invited to an American home before. My children have never had Christmas like this before. We had decorated the backyard. We put Christmas lights up in the backyard and the kids went out. And so like what was going to be just a normal evening, we just thought about it a little bit differently. And then we just invited people, and people were inviting other people that we didn't even know. Like, who are these people that are coming to our house? And so whether you live in Montgomery, Alabama, or whether you live in Studio City or wherever you are, those people are around who don't connect if we just could find a way to say, hey, come. And I walked outside of the church here, and today I'm like, oh my goodness, your whole community is out here. And I know you.
They don't come in here all the time.
I know. And I know that you do a lot of stuff with them, but just think about people who are just coming to the park to be able to, like, afterwards or at different times, be able to connect with them, so. And there are, I know you want to talk about, policy issues and those types of things, but that's where you start as a Christian. You start from, Jesus died for all people. He loves all people. He calls all people to himself. We join together in churches. That's our message, the gospel that calling people to God together. And then from there, especially when you have a unique and diverse body of believers, you can speak that message, with confidence, and they will listen, And then the other part of it is we live in a nation that we get to speak into how things work here. This is really unique experiment. My background before I went to seminary was as a social studies teacher, right? So I'm a civics teacher, history teacher. That's my training. That's my background. And when I kept studying, I really love that stuff. Like I love knowing how our government works, and I love people participating and political science and all that is kind of a passion. But we live in this really unique country where everybody gets to say, and we all get to talk about how things should be. And as Christians, we get to talk about how things should be in our society. Like, that's what we're supposed to do, even as American citizens. So we get to speak from a perspective of, I'm a follower of Jesus, and Jesus says that life should look like this. This is what on earth as it is in heaven. And now I get to speak that into the political realm, which is just a sphere of life. All politics means is how we organize life together. It comes from the word polis, which means the people or the city, how we come together and how we govern our lives. And so we get to speak on the basis of biblical principles to our government and say, we would like for things to look this way. So what I tell people is, the Bible talks about how, God's heart for the sojourner, that we should welcome the sojourner, we should treat them as native born. That doesn't mean that American policy has to look just like Scripture, because America is not Israel and America is not the church. It's a secular country. But as God's people, as Christians in America, we get to speak God's vision into the process. Does that make sense? So that's not trying to control. The church should never try to control the government or should try to control life in a country, but we get to witness to that nation what we think God's word is. And sometimes they'll listen to us and sometimes they won't. And when they won't, we continue to bless and we continue to encourage and we continue to serve and we submit to the governing authorities as we have to, but we don't stop witnessing who God is and what he says. And so that's the perspective I take to this is I'm not trying to control anything. When I speak about what immigration policy should look like from a biblical perspective, I'm witnessing to the government and saying, will you consider these things as you make your decisions?
You probably heard this objection. Sometimes people say churches should just focus on preaching the gospel.
Right.
Preach the gospel. Immigration and the surrounding issues are politics, race issues, whatever, race relations. You can take any number. You could be pro-life issues. Churches should just preach the gospel, see individuals come to faith, and disciple them. What would you say? And so, don't tell me all this immigration stuff.
Yeah.
Leave that to someone else. What would you say to that? You kind of answered it.
Yeah.
From your perspective. But.
Yeah. Well, there's a real danger to that because the witness of the church, we witness to God's character, right? So that's what holiness is. That's why we obey God. It is for our benefit. It is for our good, but it's also so that we, as a people who come to know Jesus, we actually come together and we tell the world this is what God is like. And so we speak that. I wrote a book on, it's called When Heaven and Earth Collide, Racism, Southern Evangelicals, and the Better Way of Jesus, as a pastor in Montgomery. It came out in 2014, where I was exploring why did the white evangelical church fail so badly on the issue of race in the South? And I was trying to explore this. And there was a really unique study done by Michael Emerson and Christian Smith called Divided by Faith. Came out in 2002, I think, something like that. And they kind of explored how evangelical Christians will often share the gospel with people and then not actually talk about anything going on in their lives or their views or their how they live, their perspective, because they just want them to get saved. If they'll just believe in Jesus, then we think, well, everything else will then work out, or we'll get to that later, okay? So that's what white evangelical Christians started doing in the South in like the 1820s and 1830s, where they were like, there's this slave society and massive racism and slavery, and then you had Baptists and Methodists who came into the South. Instead of confronting the evil that was going on, they said, well, we won't talk about that now, we'll just share the gospel. And then once people get saved and becomes Christians, then we'll talk about that later. Well, tomorrow never came, in that. Because they were sharing the gospel, people were joining their churches and getting saved. But then the preacher, when they would try to confront the sin of slavery and of racism, they couldn't do it because all of the slave owners had come into the church and they would have lost their jobs. And now they can't speak because now they're controlled by the people that they didn't confront to begin with. Does that make sense at all? So this happened in the South in the 1820s and 30s. You had churches that were abolitionists, Baptists and Methodists coming south were abolitionists to begin with. And then they shifted to by 1840, 1845, they actually were pro-slavery because they just told people how to get saved and they didn't confront, or they maybe would confront alcohol drinking, or they would confront, sexual issues, but they didn't confront how people were being treated, right? And so then the church begins to change its theology to say, well, this is actually God's will, that black people be treated this way. And then you have these theologies that develop, like the curse of Ham and other things that say the white people are superior to black people, and that's how God wants it. And that developed over time.
Could you explain what the curse of Ham is? Because that comes up.
Yeah. Well, it was this heresy that was developed that said that goes all the way back to Noah, and one of his sons. Well, it was Ham, Shem, and Japheth. And so after the flood, Ham sees his father Noah, who had gotten drunk, and he walks in on him and sees him naked. Instead of covering his shame, his nakedness, he kind of stays there too long, or he looks when he shouldn't have. And so Noah wakes up and the story is that he basically cursed Ham and said that you'll serve your brothers and serve others. Well, then people thousands of years later in the American South said, oh, Ham, he's the ancestor of the African nations, and Shem and Japheth, they're the ancestors of the wider nations, and so Ham has to serve his brothers. That means Africa has to serve Europe. I mean, it was really stupid, but that's what they developed. But that's what happens when you just preach the gospel. Now, the gospel, the real gospel, is the reconciliation of all of creation to God through Christ. And so the real gospel affects everything. It affects all of our lives, the way we think, the way we live. It all comes under Jesus. And it also affects society. Now, you're saved through faith in Christ, but that salvation then affects everything. But you had this really narrow, truncated, quote-unquote, gospel that was being preached, and then everything else was allowed to just kind of keep going as a mess. So whenever people say, well, you shouldn't get involved in immigration, you shouldn't get involved in these things because you should just preach the gospel, I point back and say, well, we tried that, and it was a disaster because people getting saved didn't change everything because they didn't know they were supposed to change because the Bible wasn't taught correctly. And then you had the division of the churches. You had millions of Africans who were enslaved, beaten, raped. I mean, all these things that took place. And then you had a civil war where 700,000 people died. And then you had 100 years of Jim Crow segregation. And we're still suffering today from what happened then. So don't tell me just preach the gospel and ignore everything else, because it ends up devastating people if people think that everything else they're doing that is sinful is okay. It doesn't hurt people. And Jesus clearly told us that we're to love our neighbor as ourselves, right? And so you don't get saved by loving other people, but if you come to Christ, if you know him, then you will love other people. You're supposed to. And we have to be taught to do that. These barriers that exist between us and others, they've been put there a long time ago, long before we were born. And we're raised in these things, and we live in this world where people are separated based on all types of external factors. And that has to be like, we have to put that aside. Our identity doesn't come from this, our skin color. It doesn't come from, outward things. If you're a Christian, your identity comes from Christ, and then he changes you, So that's a long answer to a short question. But what I would say is that the gospel itself does have implications in all of these areas. How we treat the sojourner. If you know Christ, if you come to know him, if you put your faith in him, then you're commanded to love people who are in need, and so we should do that. And we do that in our systems. We do that in our politics. We do it at work. We do it at school. We do it all over, everywhere we go. So, yeah.
Well, why don't we, we've got about 20 more minutes. Why don't we open it up to questions that people might have around anything that...
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff that's been going on. This summer you had the family separation at the border issue. I got a good question last night about that from a friend that I was staying with, and he said, well, why? He said, I get it. I get that families, are being separated. I know that, nobody wants to see that, but people came here illegally, and then you break the law and you can't stay with your kids. And so tell me why this is wrong, or tell me why this is a problem. And so it was a great question. I'll just give you the quick answer just to get us started. But I told him, I said, well, a lot of these people, when they come in and present themselves for asylum, that's legal. Like, our law says that you can legally come and present yourself from asylum if you have a credible fear. If you're fearing persecution or, violence in your home country, you can come and you can make that case. And up until this April, we weren't separating the kids from their parents while they were waiting for their a case to be heard by the courts. And so that was a new thing. And so that created a whole lot of problems. We weren't prepared for it. And you had parents and children separated and all that. So when I explained to him, I said, the people coming, presenting themselves for asylum and saying, I want asylum, actually, we're not breaking the law. Our law allows for that. But yeah, we were treating them like they were criminals by separating it. So that was the issue from a legal perspective. And then you have the human rights issues and the parents and children and all that. So when I explained that, he's, I didn't understand that. I didn't know that. Thank you very much. So there are all these questions with immigration. If you think you know about it, you don't. It's the most complicated issue in American life as far as politics. But anyway, so that's one example. Do you guys have other thoughts or questions or things you see happening that you've wondered about? Sure. Yeah, absolutely. And, that's why you have to be educated. That's why you have to know what's going on. You can't be naive. I personally don't let anybody else's agenda affect my own. We have a mandate. Those groups, America has 330 million people in our country, and we have a lot of people with a lot of ideas. And one of the real downfalls of media is that you can have 4 people stand in front of a camera and say something, and then the whole nation sees it, and then we think, oh, that's the danger, that's the thing out there, and understandably so. If that were to grow, it's ridiculous. It's something that should be rejected outright, and it's something that is so far on the extreme, and even if it gathers adherence, it's something that should be opposed. Absolutely. What I'm talking about is within the context of, I personally am against illegal immigration. I don't want anybody coming here illegally. I'm for borders and border security and those things, and we need to encourage that. Because when people come here illegally, that is bad for them. It puts them in a very negative situation, puts their children in a negative situation right away. It makes it difficult for people to know who's supposed to be here and who's not. It makes it hard for people to integrate. It keeps people in cultural silos where they can't, they're afraid to interact with others, and it's bad for the country. I can make a very strong case against illegal immigration. What I speak to is how do we treat people who come to us from other places from a biblical perspective? So yes, there absolutely is a negative view on both sides, in the sense of the ones who are like really absolutely nobody come here at all, and then ones who say that we shouldn't even have a country. Both of those extremes are wrong. I would agree with that. and just being aware. So that's why if we start from a biblical perspective, then we speak to both sides. If you start with politics in America, and if you start with where you want to be or where groups want to take you, you're always going to end up in a mess. If you start with Scripture, you end up in a better place. And being from Montgomery, Alabama, we don't see Antifa there very much. We see League of the South, which is, they didn't go to Charlottesville, but every Friday and Saturday night in Wetumpka, Alabama, or on weekends right up the road, they have a large group that meets and gathers. But those aren't even the ones. Even those folks aren't the ones to really worry about. It's the people who are grabbing hold of these views, who don't show up for rallies, but yet they're playing them out in other ways. So a lot of the stuff that you see on television is.
Yeah, shared from the Revelation 2, what Jesus says to the churches, and I think it was Laodicea was the one that's neither hot nor cold, and it seemed like they were lacking zeal, they were lacking, there's almost no truth at all to get excited about.
Right.
Yep. And then the rebuke against Ephesus was, look, you've apparently done great defending truth, and you kicked out the Nicolaitans, you hate the Nicolaitans, who I hate, but you've become, lost your first love. You failed to love your neighbor, love God, love one another. And so it seems their zeal was not wrong, but their love was cold towards neighbor. And I kind of talked about the errors of two ways: forgetting there's any truth at all, and that could be the no borders, whatever.
Right.
But then you can be so clatching on to pharisaical and the truth that you forget to love. You forget Jesus uses the Good Samaritan, an example of what it looks like to neighbor love someone. Jesus used the example of a person for a first century Jew that would have been, that person cannot be a good example of someone that loves and cared for. And now go and do likewise.
Yeah. I mean, you definitely, working from the perspective of loving your neighbor and having an orderly society, you can and should make a strong case for for borders and for people coming the right way, and for people being processed through, and those types of things, so that they're able to stay and they're able to work and people know who they are and that type of thing. Because if there's total chaos and anarchy, then no one can flourish or prosper. With the parents and children at the border who were coming to present themselves for asylum, that was legal. Our government does allow for that. There was a caravan. I don't know if you saw that caravan that was coming up through Mexico, and people were really upset about it as the caravan was coming. Like, this is an invasion, and they're going to take over, and it's it's all this. And what was interesting about the caravan, which didn't really make the news very much, is that every single person in that caravan was allowed into the United States, because they all came and legally presented themselves for asylum. So even though it was like, oh no, what are we going to do? These people are coming, they're invading our country. The reality was they came, legally presented themselves, and by law, we had to take them in for their cases to be heard in the courts. Now, whether they should stay or not, the courts need to decide that. There are things that you need to do to make sure they show up for the court and all of that. But just the idea that they were invading to come in illegally was not the case. And so, we talk about rule of law and how the laws work. Those are all things we need to look at. How do we make this work better? How do we help it work better? What are the outcomes? What are the processes here? And that's all stuff that needs to be decided. My point is just in saying that the church has a role in that, right? We should call for order. We should call for things to be done properly and the right way. And we should also call for people to be treated with dignity and with love and respect. And when you balance those things, then you can get a pretty good result out of that.
The United States has a certain number of people that they kind of figure to immigrate here every year, like, or is it just a free-for-all, like a billion people can come?
No.
Is there like a number that they kind of go, okay, after this, we're going to put it on that?
Right. So there are waiting lists of people that have to wait years and years because they apply, and countries have quotas. And there are all these different things. Even if you're a family member, say you're the brother of a U.S. citizen, who has green card immigrant, and you live in another country, and your brother sponsors you, it could take over a decade for you to be accepted because of the quotas and because of the numbers. It ends up being around 1.1 million people per year that are able to come through, through the quotas, which seems like a lot, but when you look at the size of our nation and birth rates are plummeting and all these different things, it actually ends up being not as much as it seems like, because it's spread out all over the whole country. Yeah, and that's why there's a need for secure borders, and there's a need for people to be able to come the right way and not come in ways where they just make themselves more vulnerable or they endanger others too. And so all those things have to be considered. They're all important. Yeah. So if I ever have a chance to, if I've actually been in this situation before where I had people asking me, my family member, or there are a lot of factors of what's going on. You have push factors, you have pull factors, you have people being lied to, you have people being trafficked. There are a lot of issues, and if you'd asked me this in 2011, 2012 when I was pastoring my church, what do you think about people who are here illegally? My answer would have been, everybody who's here illegally needs to leave. They shouldn't be here. I also thought, I was rock solid on that. Like, I would defend that position, but I hadn't really given it a lot of thought. I didn't understand how people got here. I didn't understand what would happen. I didn't know that there had been almost 30 years of corruption, where you had businesses that were lying to people and telling people to come. You had people who were being brought here. You had people who were being brought here as little children, with not even aware that they were being brought here illegally. And then they grew up here and they're considered illegal immigrants because they didn't come the right way and they weren't born here. That's what the Dreamers, you see that, in the news as well. I just kind of thought that, if you're brought here as a kid, you could probably go to the post office and apply for legal status once you turned 18. Like that made sense to me. And then I found that wasn't the case. You had no recourse. You couldn't. And then you have DACA, and then you have Dreamers and all that stuff that, that came about. So, but the main thing that kind of began to help me understand a little bit better is that there isn't one way that people come. It's not a uniform thing. It's not all 25-year-old grown men, drug dealers coming across the desert to do wrong. It's people who get brought, lied to. 40% overstay their visas. They shouldn't, but we don't always know what exactly happened. What's happening in Central America right now, the stories that we're hearing of people coming from Guatemala and El Salvador and Honduras, abuse. They can't go to the police. The police are being controlled by the cartels and, the gangs and things like that. So I'm not saying that everybody should come here by any means. And there should be borders, and there should be a right way to come. And if you don't meet that, then you shouldn't be able to just come because you want to. But at the same time, I understand it's a lot more complicated than I thought. Somebody came years ago and now it's 20 years later. Now what do they do? So
take one more question, Jason.
Okay.
So I think a lot of us get we're kind of hopeless in this kind of thing, because it's a huge issue and there's tons of things connected to it. Political partisanship and all these organizations that are all jumping on it.
Yeah.
So, two parts. How can we educate ourselves in this, just so we have a basic understanding of what's going on, perhaps more than just what you get from a major network that's going to tell you what you want to hear?
Yeah.
How do we educate ourselves in a good way, and then how can we amplify maybe a positive message in our life? We'll talk about what we got in the church, but what are some of the
The first part of being informed is to recognize that you probably don't know nearly as much as you think you do. And that's not insulting, that's just humility. This whole discussion from both the left and the right is biased. It's biased on both sides all the time. And so ferreting through what is actually real, what's actually going on. I do that basically full time, trying to figure out. I've been wrong. And I work at it. I work hard. I know trusted sources. I know people to go to. I know how to pick up the phone and call people. And then I inform others. That's my job. And I've made mistakes because something seemed to be a certain way, but then it was being reported. I'm not going to get in the whole fake news thing and all that, But that's on both sides. It's on the right. It's on the left. And you're getting what a certain group wants you to know almost every time the issue of immigrants or refugees comes out. So what that means is you have to listen to both, and then you have to kind of train your mind and your ears to know what seems right. So like when this stuff started happening with the family separation at the border, even though I'm an immigrant and refugee advocate, I should have jumped all over that right from the beginning. Oh, this is wrong and everything. I spent 3 or 4 weeks and I never said a word about it. This was building and growing because I wasn't going to speak before I knew what was happening, not just what I was being fed, right? And then when I realized, okay, those who are presenting themselves for asylum, that's legal to do, and they're still having their children separated from them. What's going on there? Why is that happening? And then I had to kind of I wish I could say there's one trusted source that you can go to get it right. Unfortunately, there really isn't. There are certain reporters you can begin to follow. One who seems to do a pretty good job. She works for Vox, but her name is Dara, or I think it's her, but Dara Lind. Does a pretty good job of trying to get to the real core issue of it, and then even saying this was, anybody who says, "Oh, Obama did it all right, now Trump's doing it all wrong," that's not true. Obama did a lot of stuff. I mean, his administration did a lot of stuff wrong. We need borders. There's some people, who are against everything. Any type of enforcement at all, they get upset about it. Well, there are people who need to be deported, because they've committed crimes and they're a danger and, things like that. But then at the same time, what about the vulnerable? So the way that I try to work through it is, okay, first of all, let me try to think about how this is affecting children, families. Are there things we can do to make this better? And then to speak about that. It's hard to get into all of the nuances of every single policy, but to think about how does this impact children? How does this impact families? Is there another solution other than just separating families or deporting kids or, things like that? And if there can be, and then what does the law actually say, then how can we speak on that behalf? So I try to stay in the realm of principles, recognize people are made in God's image. That's a really good place to start. That if possible, families should stay together. That people who come here need to work and not be a burden to taxpayers, like what you're talking about. We don't just need people to flood in and to just take every service. I mean, the law says you're not supposed to. If you're an undocumented immigrant, you're not eligible for these services. But then they have children who are born here who are eligible, and so then you have this mix. So we need to fix that. The rule of law needs to be upheld. We can't just ignore what the law says. That's important as well. And then there needs to be, and a lot of people are saying there needs to be some type of way for people who would qualify, who work, who speak English, who are pursuing trying to fix things. Maybe they got brought here, maybe they're trafficked here, maybe they came here 20 years ago when the border was basically a lot more open than it is now, and now they've had kids who are citizens. Is there some way where they could pay restitution and where they could get on some type of a pathway to legalization, especially if they have kids and things like that? So, those are kind of some of the things that we talk about as principles. Are these things possible? Can we do these things? And you work from there. But as far as knowing exactly who to trust, I know who not to trust because whenever people are lying or there's propaganda on one side or the other, you say, okay, well, they have an agenda. But unfortunately, you see that on both sides. So you have to work at it. You have to. Cable news is not a good source of information. On pretty much anything. Although sometimes they do a good job and sometimes they tell the truth. You can't that's actually true what they said. That's good. But you have to kind of look a little bit deeper and you have to study. And with the internet, you can do that. You can actually go, okay, I'm not gonna get all my information on immigration from Breitbart, or from Huffington Post or whatever. But I'm actually going to try to see what's actually local news is a good place. If you can, see something that happened, what does the local newspaper say? Or what does the local news station say? They're probably going to be more accurate than a national, these pundits and national media figures, they can't possibly know everything that they are so rock solid, angry about. There's no way that one person can have all that information and actually be accurate. So you kind of have to really work through it,
Yeah. Well, we've reached our time.
Okay.
I know you. You gotta get going.
Yeah.
You've been traveling all across the country.
I have, yeah.
I thank you so much for speaking. These are difficult issues, even for us to discuss, and as the church is one thing. Then how do we interact as citizens in this country, and how should we advocate? How should we not? What is true? And you do this all over in lots of different churches, with lots of different people. So I'm just so thankful that you're speaking into it and working hard. And one thing we didn't mention as a closing, our network of churches, our convention, the Southern Baptist Convention, passed a resolution. Has passed several over the years. But as a network of Southern Baptist churches, we've said, I think the resolution this year was, we value, all immigrants, refugees are created in the image of God and worthy of dignity, value, and worth. But I think it also said we value a path to citizenship for those who...
To legalization, yeah. For those who would qualify, and it could pay restitution. Secure borders, we're asking for that. We want the borders to be secure,
And if you're in California and you're doing ministry, you are going to have people in your churches, Christians in your churches, who either are undocumented, potentially. I know lots of California Southern Baptist pastors close to the border who up to 50% of their church can be believers who are active, who might be even pastors who may have DACA status or may have expired. So churches are going to deal with this issue here too. So it is something, but that's something that as our convention has said together. This is what we value and pursue. But I thank you so much again.
Yeah.
All you've done, and we'll go ahead and end it here. So make sure you thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, appreciate it.